everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining this webinar on COP28, Global Climate Cooperation in a Fractious World. My name is Diarmuid Torney. I'm a co-director of the Centre for Climate and Society here in Dublin City University and an associate professor in the School of Law and Government, also here in DCU. The DCU Centre for Climate and Society is Ireland's first academic research centre devoted to promoting perspectives on climate change from the social sciences and humanities. We examine how different social arenas, such as politics, media, education, business, and policy can influence climate action. Later this week, representatives of the world's governments will gather in Dubai for this year's United Nations Climate Change Conference, also called COP28. After a year of climate extremes across the world, one might hope that the attention of world leaders will be firmly fixed on the climate crisis. But COP28 is taking place against the backdrop of an increasingly fractious world, with ongoing war in Ukraine and Gaza, and providing a challenging context for global cooperation. Key issues for this year's COP agenda include climate change adaptation and mitigation, climate finance, and loss and damage. COP28 will also hold the first so-called global stocktake, the 5-yearly review of progress under the Paris Agreement, aimed at assessing collective progress. To discuss the key issues facing COP28 and to set the scene for us, we are joined by a distinguished panel of experts: Sinead Walsh, Conor O'Neill, Matt McGrath, and Lucy Gaffney. I will introduce each of them properly in just a minute, but first, some housekeeping. The webinar will last for approximately 1 hour and will run roughly as follows. I will introduce each of our 4 speakers in turn and ask them an opening question. We will then move to a discussion amongst our panel members. Then, during the final 20 minutes or so, we will take questions from you, the audience. Please use the Q&A function on Zoom to pose questions to our panelists. The chat function has been disabled because it's easier for us to manage the questions through the Q&A function. And so to our opening contributions. I will start off with Dr. Sinead Walsh, who has been Climate Director at Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs since 2020. Prior to this, she served as the EU Ambassador to South Sudan and Irish Ambassador to Sierra Leone and Liberia. Before joining the government, Sinead spent 10 years in the NGO sector, predominantly with Concern Worldwide, working in India, Pakistan, Rwanda, and South Sudan, as well as in a global advocacy role. Sinead, turning to you, loss and damage was a big issue at last year's COP. You have been a member of the transitional committee that was tasked over the intervening period to operationalize the loss and damage fund that was agreed at COP28. Can you tell us about those negotiations and the deal that was reached recently? And what other priority topics will Ireland be focusing on at COP28?
Thanks, Diarmuid, and hi everybody. It's good to be here. I notice that what DCU do is you organize this pre-COP seminar so close to COP that people like me couldn't possibly manage to to have a pre-scripted set of remarks. So we are forced to just speak off the cuff. So you're expecting to get lots of really good scoops. But I'll try not to disappoint you anyway. Yeah, loss and damage. It's been a very, very heavy year, I can say. I think the transitional committee has I think took us all by surprise. Actually, those of us who were on it, I don't think any of us could have expected it to be so incredibly intense between March and just actually earlier this month when we finally reached agreement. So, but I suppose just to go back slightly, I think a lot of people watching will have will be kind of familiar with what happened at COP27, which was that Ireland was very involved in reaching an agreement or getting an agreement over the line on loss and damage. And I suppose this goes back maybe about 30 years, where particularly small island states, but also countries like Bangladesh and so on, have been making the point that you know, it's too late actually in some cases to adapt to climate change in some of their situations. So say, for example, if you're in Fiji, if you live in a community close to the coast, you know, there's no sea wall that's going to be able to, you know, to sort of compete with the level of sea level rise, and communities have just had to be relocated, and of course we can all imagine how incredibly difficult that would be, you know, not just in terms of economic, but also the sort of you know, the links, the religious, the spiritual, the community links that are there. So last year at COP27, and Minister Ryan was very involved in this on behalf of the EU, we finally reached an agreement to you know, to start a process of having a specific loss and damage fund and funding arrangements. So and as I said, I've sat on that committee that's been kind of planning that since March. It was very difficult, to be honest. I mean, we really had a lot of very different views, not just between the developed country and the developing countries, but also within developed and developing countries. And we did really struggle to reach an agreement. But we did reach an agreement at about 11 o'clock on a Saturday night a few weeks ago in Abu Dhabi. And I think, you know, it's one of those instances where, you know, nobody is fully happy with what we agreed, but in some ways, you know, maybe that's okay. You know, we all had to compromise on what we ultimately wanted. I think from an Irish perspective, I mean, maybe just to say briefly what was agreed. I mean, we've basically agreed to set up a fund which will have the World Bank as an interim secretariat for the first 4 years. But essentially we'll have a board made up of countries that's going to be making all the decisions. It's more of an administrative role for the World Bank. And the board is going to be made up of a variety of countries. And one of the things Ireland pushed for is sort of special extra seats for the poorest countries, for least developed countries and small island states on the board, because Ireland's main priority in this whole process was making sure that the most vulnerable countries would be, you know, prioritized essentially in this fund, and we managed to propose and we're very happy to see it stay in a minimum allocation floor within the fund for least developed countries and small island developing states. So I think, you know, that kind of language and the fact that we have agreed, you know, on a fund that should be basically getting up and running, you know, next year within 2024. I think that sort of gave us, you know, the reassurances that we wanted. But it was a very controversial process. Maybe the most controversial point, and the reason why we initially failed to agree on the new fund was the issue that we call sources. So basically, this was the question of to what extent did we state that, you know, developed countries should put money, you know, into the fund, should take the leadership in putting money into the fund, you know, versus maybe, you know, thinking about some of the developing countries, like say, for example, Saudi Arabia or the UAE itself, that are classified as developing countries because the list was written in 1992, but which have now, you know, got a great deal of wealth. And shouldn't we also be encouraging them to put finance into the fund? So that was the most contentious issue. But at the same time, you know, we have an agreement. It's an agreement that will, you know, hopefully not be reopened at COP, would be our hope. So because any country could, in theory, object to that at COP. But we hope that doesn't happen, because we're really keen as Ireland, and I know it's the same for other EU member states, we're really keen to pledge finance to the fund as soon as possible, and to have it start working as soon as possible. So that's kind of where we are, and we're waiting to see what's going to happen in terms of finalizing the agreement or finalizing the recommendations of the committee. So anyway, happy to answer any questions on that, but I think a pretty acceptable outcome of a very, very difficult process, I can say. And maybe just a final word in terms of other Irish priorities, and I know lots of other people will be talking about this as well. I mean, the top priority has to be mitigation. The best way to avoid loss and damage is to mitigate, actually, and the second best way is to adapt. And then, loss and damage is really only what you do when those two things have failed. So, we're really keen, I think, as Ireland and as the EU, to have good fossil fuel language in the final text. I think there's some sort of energy, sort of renewable targets, tripling of renewable energy, doubling of energy efficiency. I think that we can probably agree on, but I think the trickier part will be what can we say about fossil fuels, and then on the adaptation side, we'd love, for example, to see more of a proper process for the doubling of adaptation finance, because that's still a little bit sort of hanging in the air. But anyway, there's lots of other Irish priorities, but that's maybe a couple of them, Diarmuid, and I'm happy to come back later. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much for that insight, Sinead, into the Transitional Committee work and Ireland's broader priorities. I'll turn next to Conor O'Neill, who is Head of Policy and Advocacy at Christian Aid Ireland, an international aid and development organisation. Conor leads Christian Aid Ireland's work on climate change and economic justice, focusing on issues of corporate accountability, inequality, human rights, and climate finance. He previously worked as a researcher in the Oireachtas, in the EU institutions, and with a human rights NGO in Brussels, and has a BA and MSc in politics from Trinity College Dublin. Conor, Christian Aid Ireland works with communities, or Christian Aid International works with communities around the world that are most impacted by the climate crisis. What is your organisation and the partners you work with hoping will come out of COP28?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Diarmuid, and for the kind introduction and for the invitation. You're absolutely right. We, as a development organisation, have worked on climate change for a number of years. We care about climate change because we see the impacts. We see the devastating and crucially disproportionate impacts that it is having in many of the poorest countries in the world that we work in. And I think the overarching ask from our partners, and the thing I would really like people watching this webinar to try and keep in mind when they follow the news for the next 2 weeks, is the kind of recognition that the climate crisis at its heart is a crisis of inequality. So on the production side, for example, the poorest half of the world, approximately 4 billion people, is responsible for about 12% of all greenhouse gas emissions. The entire continent of Africa, about 1.5 billion people, is responsible for approximately 4% of emissions from fossil fuels. There are estimates that sub-Saharan Africa will take on debt of about $1 trillion over the next decade if long pledged financial support isn't finally delivered at the scale that's needed. So that's the production side. The flip side of it, and the kind of cruel inequality of it, is that the impacts are disproportionately falling on those who have done least to cause the crisis and who have least resources to try and adapt to it. People in poverty in the countries we work in tend to live in places that are more susceptible to climate change, live more exposed livelihoods, less secure housing, less access to social safety nets. The flip side of this is that, for example, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction estimated that people in low and middle income countries are 7 times more likely to die from a climate-related impact than people in wealthy countries like Ireland. So that kind of global justice inequality framing is the essential frame that we think people should look at these negotiations. And the kind of big ask for every COP is always, will that be recognised? Will that be present not just in the speeches and in the language? Will it be present in the actual text? Will it be present in the decisions coming from it? And will you see wealthy, high-emitting countries, we very much include Ireland in that, committing to do their fair share? When it comes to that fair share, maybe being a bit more specific and following some of the themes that Sinead mentioned, the 2 key things for us really are fossil fuels and finance. So in the first one, on fossil fuels, it's about getting our emissions down, particularly in this part of the world, as fast as humanly possible. We supported the Global Day of Action in support to end fossil fuels in September, and the strapline for that was fast, fair, and forever. And I think you're going to see a lot of focus on that at this COP, fighting over the language of how strong it's going to be. And we want to see that to be strong. And we also want to see the follow-up from that, depending on what the language comes out of it. The second part, though, I think is something that we have tried to focus on as much as possible over the last number of years. We think that finance and financial support is the kind of starkest, clearest global justice litmus test of the COP process. You have pre-existing pledges for financial supports, the global target to provide $100 billion, for example, dating all the way back to the UNFCCC in the 90s, reinforced in the Paris Agreement in 2015, to do that by 2020. That was badly missed. The most recent data from the OECD suggests that we're kind of just about limping over the line, 4 or 5 years late. But if you dig into those figures, the vast majority of the finance that has been provided so far for mitigation and for adaptation has been in the form of loans. To our credit, that is something that Ireland hasn't done. Almost all of the climate finance that we provide is focused on least developing countries and where it's needed most. It's focused on funding adaptation, and it is grant-based, untied aid. That is the kind of thing we would really like the Irish government to advocate for and emphasize really strongly, and the principles underpinning that being reflected in the COP negotiations. I guess the last thing to finish on what Sinead mentioned is on this question of finance. There is going to be a lot of focus this year on loss and damage, rightly so, because you had the previous context, which is financial agreements and all this infrastructure set up around them to essentially pay for two things: mitigation and adaptation. And the fight for decades was to try and get recognition for this so-called forgotten third pillar of loss and damage. As Sinead said, the thing that you have to do after mitigation adaptation has failed. The breakthrough last year was historic, but it was essentially an agreement in principle. It was the first time the whole COP, especially wealthy, high-emitting countries, said, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to set up this fund. And then it brought in this period of negotiations that Ireland was a member of through the Transitional Committee. And we followed them as well as civil society. We don't have the same behind closed doors input that Sinead does, but you can see that they were extremely difficult. And in that sense, I think the framing of this webinar of a fractious world and a challenging global order, what has been produced is probably a success relative to where the global center is and what's agreeable. Those things that Ireland emphasised are important. So the decision-making role of developing countries on the board, a kind of floor of resources and a prioritisation, as opposed to an exclusion for SIDS and LDCs, are really important. At the same time, what is going to go to COP, what is on that text, still is an essentially voluntary fund with no clear obligation to pay. There is no specific amount that ought to be raised or provided, even as a target. There is no specific deadline to get there. And that is not to try and be critical for criticism's sake, but I think we have to be honest and say that if the Irish government published a plan like that here, I don't think it would be acceptable. And a lot of our partners are saying the same. There is just this worry that because of what comes out of these intergovernmental processes, what comes out of COPs tends to be kind of vague at times. They're worried that funding won't be sufficient to meet the level of need, which is massive. So I think people should interpret this COP as the lowest common denominator position. What comes out of these negotiations is always what everybody from Pakistan to Peru, Ireland to India can all agree on. And then the key work starts the minute the COP is over, where we take this decision text and we say, okay, well, this is the floor of ambition. This is the lowest common denominator position. And if that is the kind of fun that we get out of it, you recognize and appreciate the work that's been done to get there. And then you immediately start working with countries like Ireland who have pushed the right priorities in international fora and say, okay, well, what is our pledge going to be? When is that contribution going to come? Do we think it aligns with the scale of need? And what is the plan to try and scale that up as urgently as possible, as quickly as possible over the next, say, 5 to 10 years? That's what we'll be looking for coming out of this. And I think if people are interested in COP as a place where geopolitics and global justice plays out, the two things to watch are fossil fuels and finance.
Great. Thanks very much, Conor, for that opening intervention. I'll turn now to Matt McGrath, who is an environment correspondent for BBC News and is an award-winning journalist with considerable experience of working in broadcast and online media. Skilled in writing, broadcast journalism, media production, and social media, Matt has a broad, detailed knowledge of environmental issues, especially climate change. He is the first international winner of the BBVA Biophilia Award and is also a former science journalism fellow at MIT in America. He's also a native of County Tipperary. And he's also a member of the advisory board of the DCU Centre for Climate and Society. In between all of that, Matt is also a COP veteran, I think it's fair to say. Matt, you've witnessed many of these environmental mega conferences over the years. What reflections do you have on how the COP process has evolved over the years? And can you tell us about the challenges of covering a COP as a journalist?
Yeah, COP veteran, Diarmuid. I think that means old git, doesn't it, in modern speak? Hi, everyone, and thanks for tuning into this webinar. It's a really interesting, the interventions so far have been really very, very useful to me anyway, as a journalist. I've been to about, I think this will be my 13th COP, going out to Dubai tomorrow. And I think this is probably the most controversial COP that we've seen so far, possibly with the most controversial president of the COP that we are likely to have seen so far. And there's a number of reasons for that. The way that the process has evolved over the last number of years, it's gone from something which was obviously large in scale going back to Copenhagen in 2009 and brought world leaders to it. You know, it kind of fell off the boil for a few years, managed to get the forces back together by Paris, and had world leaders come together to put together the Paris Agreement, essentially, by then. Since then, though, it's become, you know, the process has evolved in a way that, you know, really so much depends on the host country and depends on the persona of the president as well. And we saw that in COP26 in Glasgow with Alok Sharma, and the UK's idea of bringing in all these side deals and these agreements on deforestation, these agreements on financing, and these agreements on a whole range of other things that were outside the principal agreement of the political leaders as they came together. And that was repeated last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, and now we're set to see that again here in Dubai, but on a much bigger scale again, expecting 70,000 people, with, as I said, possibly the most controversial head of a COP ever in place. As some of you may have seen the BBC story this morning about Sultan Al Jaber, the president designate of the COP, being advised on how to conduct meetings with a number of different countries and given speaking points by ADNOC, the oil company that he also chairs, to do deals with some of these countries, including Brazil, Germany, and a number of others, to encourage, I suppose, the securing of more fossil fuels into the world. So it would seem, according to many observers on this, that this would be kind of at odds with his role in terms of trying to lead the world away from the use of fossil fuels, that he may be seen to be actively promoting the use of fossil fuels, the recovery of fossil fuels, the growth of fossil fuels in his job as COP28 president speaking to countries. So I think that makes it very controversial. I don't think we've ever had a situation like that. And I think it's going to raise some serious questions about the credibility of this process going forward. There'll be a number of other stories this week, not just from the BBC, but from others as well, examining both the role of the COP president designate and also the oil company ADNOC and others as well. Can you really have a deal, or can you really have a COP that's run by the people who are making the most money out of fossil fuels? Can you really have an attempt at phasing out fossil fuels run by these people? Some people will say, yes, you need these people on board. You'll never get a deal without them. Others will say they've captured the process and this is just greenwashing of the greatest extent, and you're not going to see very much progress on that. But I think having said all that about the controversy and all the rest of it, I still think there is great potential in this process for some major achievements. As we've been hearing already, loss and damage seems like it's ready to go. And if you consider that, 3 years ago, people weren't even allowed to talk about loss and damage at the COP. Now we're going to a situation where we may have a fund that's operationalized, have money in it by the end of this COP. I think that's undoubtedly progress. We're likely to see something on the tripling of renewables, the doubling of energy efficiency, and the language on phasing down, phasing out, moving away from. There's some interesting thoughts coming out from the United States and from China in their statement that they issued last week, talking about absolute reductions from the power sector in this decade. And maybe some of that language might be incorporated into some deal that comes out of COP28. So it's, in some respects, words fail me really, because it is such in some respects, you might argue, an appalling vista to see an event of this scale and this importance for the world being essentially run by the fossil fuel industry at a time when the biggest contributor to global warming is the fossil fuel industry. But perhaps also it's the best opportunity yet to find some form of solution that moves the world away from fossil fuels in the long term, with the richer countries going forward first. So look, all to play for, I think, to sum up a sports analogy. Really interesting COP, but the most controversial. And if it all fell down, I wouldn't be a bit surprised.
Matt, thanks very much for that overview and perspective, and that question of the host country and the president designate may be something I suspect that might come up in the questions from the audience later. Last but by no means least, I'll turn to Lucy Gaffney, who is a bioscientist and entrepreneur. In November 2021, Lucy joined Natural Capital Ireland to lead the development of a national business and biodiversity platform funded by the Irish government. In 2021, Lucy also established Wild Plan, a private consultancy which provides support to SMEs on their journey to nature positive. In January, Lucy was named as one of the Irish Times 50 people to watch in 2023 for her ongoing work in the business and biodiversity space. I don't know, at the end of 2023, does that mean we have to stop watching you? Yeah. Is it for 1 year only, Lucy?
Just a year, yeah.
Right. Lucy, biodiversity has sometimes been seen as the poor relation of climate change in the policy arena, and indeed in the business world and among civil society as well. It has belatedly garnered increased attention in recent years. How do you think biodiversity and climate concerns can be better integrated, and what hopes do you have in this regard in terms of COP28?
Yeah, thanks, Diarmuid, for the introduction. I'm delighted to be taking part in this discussion. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to bring nature into this discussion, because it's often overlooked, as you said, and it's often regarded as that poor relation. And I suppose the first point that I want to make is it's time we stop separating the two issues, because they're part of the same broader problem. And I think that's one of the things that is part of the remit of the work that I do, is to try and bring those two worlds together, that climate and biodiversity are inextricably linked, and we will solve one by solving the other. Certainly nature has a massive role to play in adapting and mitigating the impacts of climate change. The second point I'd like to make is that we cannot underestimate the role that business has to play in both addressing climate issues and biodiversity, because essentially the biodiversity crisis has happened and ecological degradation has happened at the hands of economic activity. So therefore, businesses have a massive role to play in addressing these two issues. And so part of the work that I do is to help businesses understand the issues a little bit more. The level of understanding and awareness and education is really lacking. So we are now trying to help businesses understand how their direct operations impact the natural world, and how they also depend on the stocks and ecosystem services provided by nature as well, and help them to develop meaningful biodiversity strategies based on that information. So essentially, I mean, I had the pleasure of going to the Biodiversity COP in Montreal, and at Montreal, they agreed the Global Biodiversity Framework, 23 targets, 2 of them very pertinent for business. And what I want to see coming out of COP28 is really just galvanizing the key aspects of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So that's really about halting and reversing nature loss by 2030. There's a big push on galvanizing the halting on deforestation. It's something that we can absolutely do. It's very possible. It was already committed to in the Glasgow Leaders Declaration. And, it's just about addressing those drivers of biodiversity loss, particularly through things like industrial agriculture, which is a big issue here in Ireland. And businesses and financial institutions, they have a major role to play. They need to remain accountable. They need to be assessing and disclosing their nature-related risks by 2030. The other thing that I wanted to touch on as well is the mobilisation of private sector finance towards biodiversity and nature restoration, and more support for the agricultural sectors as well in that just transition towards regenerative agriculture. I think that's a discussion that needs to happen. I know Eamon Ryan is heading to COP with the promise of developing the polluter pays principle. I think that's incredibly important. That will certainly push us forward. I think there's a lot of things that businesses can do. There's a very strong nature presence there now. The Nature Positive Pavilion will be present. They have a number of asks that they are hoping for in COP as well, namely that they're looking for greater urgency around that halting of deforestation. They're looking for to secure tenure for Indigenous peoples and local communities, and they're looking to close that funding gap, which is estimated to be around 800 billion for nature restoration. So there's a lot of work to do on nature as well. We need to start having conversations that include nature and climate together, and I think there's a lot of positive things that could come out of COP28.
Thanks, Lucy, for that, and emphasising the interconnections between nature and climate and the role of business. Can we move now into the panel discussion? So can I ask our four panelists to turn on their videos, and they should magically appear alongside me on the screen. Sinead and Matt. Great. Good to see you all back again. So I might kick things off with a couple of questions to you all, and you can pick and choose from which questions you'd like to answer. And while we do that, can I encourage our audience to post any questions you would like to ask in the Q&A function? So we've, as I said at the beginning, we've disabled the chat, so please use the Q&A function for that. And I see there's one question there already. So one question I wanted to throw out to you all is around the global stocktake. I referenced this in the introduction. So this is the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. Apart from stating the obvious that we're not on track, what hopes and expectations do you have for this process and its outcomes at COP? Who would like to come in on that?
I don't mind coming in, Diarmuid. I don't have a ton to say because I think really, I mean, it's a little bit as Matt has said. You know, the global stocktake is to review our progress, and we know, I think, that our progress has been quite poor, but at the same time, and you know, I was thinking of this as Lucy was speaking. You know, we also have to bear in mind that, you know, this is the UNFCCC, the COP process is only one strand of what we can and should be doing, and if we look at, you know, some of the positives, you know, there's this sort of slew every year of these pre-COP reports, and the one that came out from Carbon Brief last week, you know, basically saying that China's emissions, CO2 emissions, might peak in 2024. I mean, that's just absolutely unbelievable. And that's not, you know, I would argue, an enormous amount to do with the UNFCCC or with the COP process. And it has a huge amount to do with the private sector. And so I'm very happy, Lucy, that you are one to watch for another 5 weeks, because I think we and I think both Conor and Matt referred to this, like, we can't overstate the significance of the COP process. It is something that has to be agreed by all countries in the world, and that's a difficult thing to do. So yes, we absolutely, you know, should make the most of it and get everything we can. And I suppose just in a rather circular way, coming back to your question, Diarmuid, I mean, I think the global stocktake is around, it's around taking a reality check and then building momentum for better progress, right? So I think, that is, and COP has a firm place in kind of international diplomacy, and that's very important. But I do every year at this period, I do definitely think that, there are sometimes expectations for COPs that are higher than are realistic, and that we need to also make sure that we're putting, loads of energy into other aspects of how we fight climate change, and not put so much emphasis on the COP as if it's going to sort of magically solve all our problems. So yeah.
Thanks, Sinead. Conor, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, thanks, Diarmuid. Just to follow up on that, I agree with that kind of general framing. The COP is I think I put it as the lowest common denominator position. It's done by consensus. So we should always come out of this, I don't think, feeling too heartened, because if you see that as the floor and you see that the floor is rising, that's kind of progress. But the key thing from our perspective is, like, we've engaged with the COP process for a very, very long time, and we still do, because it is crucially important to have this space once a year that focuses minds politically. It's very hard to get politicians time. It's very hard to get so many prime ministers to think and talk about climate change and kind of nothing else for such a concerted period of time. Journalists are focused on it in a way that the general political core doesn't always do it. So it is a good kind of sense check. But I think if people are watching this and they, on the one hand, are seeing that kind of reality that the COP process is very imperfect, the best way to combat that is the day after COP, contact every single one of your local representatives. Send them the articles that appear from Matt on the BBC and in the Irish Times and RT or whatever about the outcomes that were promised, and ask them specifically what national actions are going to be taken to meet this. Because I think a lot of the outcomes in terms of mitigation and how on track we are, the 1.5 degree target of warming, are going to be that we're way off. And sometimes individual countries can hide in the aggregate. So in Ireland, we have a climate law that was passed. We have a series of carbon budgets under that climate law. We ourselves are overshooting those carbon budgets where it looks very unlikely they're going to stick to them. So I think if people watch and feel a little bit frustrated that the COP process is intergovernmental and imperfect, go straight to your politicians, because we have a lot of power in Ireland. We can make sure that we up our action, and there are levers you can pull there, starting by contacting every political representative whose email you can find on the Monday morning straight after COP.
Thanks for that, Conor. I think you went a long way, actually. I'm keeping an eye on the Q&A function to answering the first question there from Brian O'Toole, which is, tell me what I can do for this COP28, please. So I might just throw that out there for others to think about as well. But Lucy, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, there's probably different expectations in the nature space. That's kind of the buzz around in the space that I work in, with the global stocktake side of things. So I just wanted to kind of throw some of those out as well for consideration. People working in the nature space are really hoping for the rapid deployment of those pledged funds, and possible additional funds for Indigenous people and local communities. That's a big piece of the nature agenda, to help them implement the nature-based solutions to help mitigate the impacts of climate change. We need to introduce effective measures to hold businesses accountable and actors within those commodity supply chains to help halt and reverse nature loss. So that's all part of the global biodiversity framework. The halt and reverse nature loss by 2030, that's kind of aligned with the Paris Agreement. So, I want to make sure that these conversations are happening in parallel. We need to commit to transforming the financial systems as well by 2030, so that we have more funding supporting nature than we have detracting from it. So that means that we need to look at pushing finance and mobilizing private sector finance into more research and development, more nature tech, into supporting SMEs, into regenerative agriculture and things like that. And I think a really key one is the reformation of environmentally harmful subsidies. That's another one that has to be on the table. It's reflected in Target 18 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And the last thing I'll say is really developing high integrity nature markets as well. So if we really want to sort of invent really good tools for mobilizing private sector financing. It has to be in biodiversity credits, where we can see private sector financing actually flowing in that direction, but they have to be high integrity, and we have to learn from the mistakes of those carbon markets of the past.
Thanks. Thanks for that, Lucy. I might move on to some other questions in the Q&A at this stage. So not everyone is identifiable in the chat, but there's a question from one anonymous attendee about US President Biden's announcement that he will not be going to COP. I think the US will be represented by John Kerry. What impact do you think that might have, given the US's overwhelming responsibility for both emissions and delaying action over the years?
Diarmuid, if I could have a
Great.
stab at that. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and we've been asking ourselves the same thing, because we're not getting President Xi, President Biden, they're not coming. We are getting the Pope, though, so that is, the first time we're having the Pope, and I wouldn't underestimate, will it be a headline if the Pope says end fossil fuels now? I think it probably will be. I'm not saying he will say that, I don't know. But the role of the US in this is quite interesting. The document they agreed with China a couple of weeks ago does give some interesting hints about where their focus is on. And they're very keen on what they call methane and non-CO2 gases and finding some sort of agreement on that. They're putting a lot of emphasis on that. They are saying that this is responsible for a huge amount of warming. It's something we can do something about in the short term. Perhaps they're trying to cook up something with China that they can get in a deal with at the COP. But Biden isn't coming. The vice president isn't coming. It's John Kerry on their own. So, it's hard to know. And the question then, the question they're really hamstrung on is how much money they can actually bring to the table, i.e. probably not a lot. But, there's a real, I suppose, expectation in some respects that maybe the US-China thing will move something forward this time around. It's critical to the whole thing.
Thanks, Matt. Would anyone else like to come in on that question? Conor, you've just unmuted, yeah.
Thanks, Diarmuid. Yeah, just briefly, I think it's a little bit disappointing, and I have to say that we and the other climate organisations we work in Ireland are all part of international networks that try and work together to push different member states ahead of, during, and after COP. And the position that some of the positions that the US has taken, especially on areas like finance, has been really, really unfortunate. For example, on loss and damage and the whole kind of justice basis of climate finance as a kind of a recognition of an ecological debt, a transfer of resources from north to south. It was the US who insisted on language in the Paris Agreement that absolutely insisted they accept no liability, or COP parlance to that effect. And I think that has been repeated. I remember listening to John Kerry, I think it was in Glasgow at that COP, talking about how this loss and damage, that amount of money, is just not realistically going to happen. So I think it is a lot of the advances that have been made, at least from our civil society perspective, have been in spite of some of the positions taken by the US on issues like finance. And I hope that if those kind of interactions carry on, we will be looking to EU countries, especially Ireland, who have taken different views, to make sure that in our statements, but also in the action we take at home, kind of stem that tide a little bit.
Thanks, Conor. Sinead, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I kind of feel like I have to stand up for the US a little bit. I mean, maybe the point is to say that, I think that the Sunnylands agreement from a couple of weeks ago that people might have seen between the US and China that Matt was referring to, I mean, that is really significant. And I think I think we need to recognize, all countries have constraints when it comes to what they can do or what they feel they can do, let's say, domestically. And one area where I think the US is really showing leadership is on methane, and methane is obviously absolutely enormous in all of this. And so, I'm not sort of disputing what others have said, but I think we also need to support the US in initiatives, which are really important and which they can play a role in and lead in. And Ireland did join the global methane pledge, for example, that is very much driven by the US, and the EU is very, very active in it as well. So I think, you know, I think that's also important, and I think it's you know, of course we'd like those of us on this call would like, you know, all countries to be equally progressive on all aspects of climate action, but I think we kind of need to take what we can get as well, and try and help you know, countries like the US to, you know, to do the things that they can do. Like, for example, they're pushing very strongly on coal at the moment, and, you know, I think we can all agree that that's a good thing. So yeah, so just to say, yes, of course, I would prefer to see President Biden there, but, you know, I think we do also need to acknowledge that there are areas where the US is able to make a good contribution.
Thanks, Sinead. I might move on with other questions in the chat. There's an easy one there. How are ambitious global greenhouse gas emissions cuts possible within the current growth-oriented economic system? I might throw that to the panel, but also move on to simultaneously to a couple of other questions. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm keen to get to there are a number of questions in the chat. So if anyone wants to come in on that question about the growth-oriented economic system. Lucy, there's a question from Susan Rosney about offsets, and are there such things as biodiversity offsets? And if so, do they have a role to play in helping businesses take action? I feel like that one is probably aimed at you, or implicitly aimed at you at least. And then there's another question about health, and the fact that there will be a health ministers' day at COP28. What do the panel see coming out of the health focus this year? Will the health argument be understood by political leaders and acted upon? So I might throw all three of those questions in the interests of time, and hopefully in the interests of someone answering at least most of the questions. So who would like to take their pick of those three questions?
I'll jump in with the biodiversity credits question, Diarmuid. I was at a panel at Climate Finance Week last week, and I was talking to some people about biodiversity offsets and biodiversity credits, or bio credits. It's an evolving space for sure. Yes, there are biodiversity offsets. We don't like them because it gives a license to continue business as usual, which we don't like. But that area is developing, and I think biodiversity credits have a lot of potential. They're different to offsets because you're not offsetting ecological harm. It's a method for investing in biodiversity, and it's actually a way of channeling private sector funding into nature restoration. So there might be, it'll all depend on how this landscape develops. So it'll all depend on how much research there is in terms of ecosystem valuation. That's hugely important. Natural capital accounting, that will help mature this space. But right now, it's very much in its nascent phase. We're still having difficulty valuing biodiversity credits and biodiversity units. So yes, it's coming. The markets have to be high integrity, and valuation has to be more mature. But I do think it'll be a really good tool to mobilize private sector finance into nature restoration, without there being an agenda that maybe might be associated with offsetting.
Okay, thanks very much for those insights, Lucy. Would anyone else like to come in on either that question or the question about the focus on health, or the question about the growth paradigm? Matt, I'll bring you in just in a minute. I just wanted to note that Sinead's either Sinead is sitting very still, or her video is frozen, but we're still hearing you fine, Sinead. Matt.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly comment on the health issue. I'm sure there'll be lots of different takes on this, but this is the first time they're having a health day, so you got to give the UAE some credit for getting that on the agenda in some shape or form. Will there be anything substantial out of it? I.e., will they say stop eating meat or anything like that? I would be very, very doubtful. So I think it'd be very interesting if some of the language from that makes it into the final statement or into the final outcomes. But I wouldn't hold my breath.
Okay, thanks, Matt, and Sinead. Welcome back visually from a slightly different angle. I think you're on a different device, but I'm now getting confused because your other profile has raised its hand. But does that mean you want to come in, Sinead?
I'm quite confused myself, Diarmuid. I hope you can hear me. I think I should look here and speak here.
No. Look,
I'll just speak loudly. I'll just speak loudly.
Yeah.
No, I wanted to come in on the point about the paradigm, the economic paradigm, not to remotely have a hope of answering it, but to come back on a point that I think Lucy made, where we really need to sort ourselves out in terms of subsidies and the polluter pays, and as Lucy said, Minister Ryan has spoken quite a bit about this, and it's something that comes up a lot in terms of the discussions on loss and damage, and how unrealistic really it is when we think about all of the costs spiraling for loss and damage, and not to even mention adaptation. And how are we going to just rely on sort of the public exchequer funding from developed countries, which has has been the kind of the default up to now. So I think that there's a lot in those conversations in terms of how can we kind of link carbon intensive activities. And if you look at Ireland, we do have quite a determined approach to our own carbon tax, even in difficult economic circumstances, frankly. So I think that's a positive. So I think without really getting into the heart of that question, I think looking at innovative financing sources is just like, we can't just keep talking about them. We've been talking about some of them for decades, and maybe this COP could be an opportunity for some real progress on one of those. And then just to very briefly refer, there was a loss and damage question in, I think it was anonymous as well, in the chat, and just to say I do agree with it. I think the survival of some some developing countries, frankly, is at risk, particularly some SIDS, and I think we can all agree that it's in all of our interest to assist with that. And I certainly would say yes, we shouldn't be looking at a sort of a charity framing of loss and damage, for sure. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Sinead. Conor, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, thanks, Diarmuid. I kind of my eyes on similar questions. Maybe to add, I was listening, for example, this morning, President Mary Robinson was talking, I think it was in UCC, and she mentioned that fossil fuel companies made $4 trillion in profits in last year alone. So I think that framing is really, really important. The research that we have published in Christian Aid Ireland with our colleagues in Trócaire, trying to look at some of the best estimates of global need to break that down to national level targets as well, it's enormous. And we kind of recognize that if we keep business as usual, and this just becomes part of the normal push and pull of budgetary parliamentary politics, it's very unlikely that we're going to succeed. So you do need that bigger paradigmatic shift of trying to say, well, the answer, the flip side of that question that always arises, how will we pay for it, is trying to look at the concentration of wealth in the modern global economy to see who is winning out of the current kind of status quo and how we can tackle it. One of the things that gives me hope in that respect is we kind of saw to an extent during the COVID, the height of the COVID pandemic, also in the response in Western Europe to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and massive inflation, that ideas, especially economic policy ideas that were previously kind of outside of the mainstream, can be pushed right back into the center with a shock that's significant enough and with the right kind of political will. For example, the idea of a tax on the so-called excess profits of multinationals, in particular on fossil fuel companies, which Antonio Guterres has called for as well. That was kind of called for a long time and resisted. And then I was looking at data from KPMG yesterday. Since last year, started last year alone, an excess profit tax has been either proposed or passed in pretty much every single EU country, 30 of them in just the last year. And that is an idea that is just suddenly ratcheted back into the center of kind of mainstream economic thinking. The same thing has to happen on the how do we pay for question on things like loss and damage. If we just keep status quo, it's not going to work. And it's good to see Irish government, Eamon Ryan in particular, emphasizing that on the polluter must pay.
Thanks very much, Conor. Sinead, your hand in your other profile is still raised, but I think that's an old hand. Yes. So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I might, we're not going to get, unfortunately, to all of the questions, but I might just throw out a couple more from chat to see if anyone wants to pick up on them. So there's a question from Jean Moore, who's from the National Economic and Social Council and another member of our Centre Advisory Board, asking about the proposal to establish a just transition work programme and to set up just transition pathways at the COP. So if anyone wants to come in on that. And one other question I'll pick out is, given the, again, from an anonymous attendee, given the current geopolitical issues globally, move to far-right anti-climate leaders in some countries, how optimistic are you for climate action in the next 4 to 5 years? We won't, I don't think, have time to go for a full round of answers from all of you, but if anyone particularly wants to come in on either of those two questions, I'd invite you to do so. Matt. Matt, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm a beginner at the Zoom thing. The just transition thing is quite interesting. We've had just transition agreements for South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, and they're in various states of success and failure. So I think there was great hopes for that a couple of years ago. I don't think the hopes are being realized as such. So I think there's more to come on that. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Matt. Sinead.
Yeah, I mean, maybe sorry, hang on. Okay, I think I'm good now.
Yeah, that's good.
It's very confusing. Just on the optimism question, I mean, is geopolitics ever going to work in favor of what we need to do on climate action? I mean, is you know, like I would tend to say no when it comes back to the question about the economic system as well. And I think we need to try to, I suppose, all work collectively to try to convince everybody else in our lives that a lot of these geopolitical considerations will become irrelevant if we don't have a livable climate. So I think probably everybody on this call feels that way. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be on this call. But it's just to say I don't think geopolitics will ever feel just quite right. There'll always be some issues going on, but we really can't let that stop us.
Thanks for that, Sinead. So unfortunately, time is against us. I'm sure you all agree that it's been a really rich and informative discussion. And unfortunately also, Matt, we're joined by a special guest.
Special guest, yeah. This little boy is he was very keen to come in and to listen to you, Diarmuid, and panel. So I couldn't keep him out.
Very good. Well, what's your name?
This is Ruan.
Hi, Ruan. Thanks for joining us.
Wait.
Can Ruan come to COP?
Yeah, I'd love if he could. Not this time, perhaps.
You'll spare him. So
okay.
Anyway, so yeah, we've run out of time. Unfortunately, we didn't get to all of the questions in the chat, but thank you to everyone who asked questions, and apologies if we didn't get to your question. If you'd like to keep in touch with our work at the DCU Centre for Climate and Society, you can sign up to our monthly newsletter at dcu.ie/climate, or follow us at DCU Climate on Twitter or X for as long as it lasts. A big thank you to our 4 panelists for taking the time to share their insights and expertise today. Sinead Walsh, Conor O'Neill, Lucy Gaffney, and Matt McGrath. They're all very busy. Matt is off to COP tomorrow. I think Sinead is off on Wednesday. So we're very grateful for you for taking the time to join us. And finally, thank you to our audience for joining us this afternoon and posing your questions in the chat. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. So thanks very much and good evening.